So in this slide, just a little refresher in the origins of schemas. And let's just remember, negative childhood adolescent experiences combined with innate temperament, combined with possible cultural influences, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, etc. All of this combined can lead to the origin of an early maladaptive schema. When we think about maladaptive coping styles, and I've alluded to this throughout as I was going through the schemas with you, these are the ways, and this is not revolutionary, right? These are the ways in which we react to a distressing stimuli. So we have surrender responses, which we think of as freeze, submit, avoidant responses, which is flee or run away, and overcompensating responses, fighting back or asserting ourselves. So in schema terms, we use words like your surrenderer, compliant surrenderer, the avoider, or the detached protector, which is another way we can refer to it when we get into the discussion of modes. And then overcompensating responses, which is the fight. So one is energized, one is running to flee, one is usually a freeze state of mind, and submitting to the threat in front of us. And this is, very much the primitive brain. So the primitive brain is designed that when it detects a threat, right, when it detects a real threat, you see the bus coming at you and you're standing there and you're inclined to jump back to get out of the way as quickly as possible. That's not weird. That's not maladaptive. That's not a maladaptive coping response. That's just I'm protecting myself. And there's a threat. And it's not just a perceived threat, it's a real threat. So to go into a flight mode in that moment is probably the wisest thing I can do to not get hit by the bus. The problem with schemas is that, they live in that same domain where, because they carry so much of the unbearable energy of early experience that lives in the, in the muscle and the tissue and the nervous system, in the memory and the brain and the cognitive structure, because it's living inside of us. When it gets activated, it feels like a threat. We feel that same, almost gasp without even realizing it, because we're moving so quickly into a response to try to protect ourselves from the threat. So that whole structure is activating the same brain mechanism that would be used for a real threat, like a bus coming at us or a gun being pointed at us. And in any of those cases, we could respond in fight, flight, freeze, or faint in some cases, as you see in my little diagram. Fight, to flee, to run away, to freeze, and perhaps just submit. And in some cases, our neurobiology would be such that we might just pass out. But this is what happens with schemas, and we want to teach our clients to begin to recognize what was the inclination that they carried when they were very young. How did it seem to evolve out of their temperament and makeup, what they learned, what they tried, because they may say, I tried fighting back. I was a little fighter in the beginning. When my parents would start getting into it and fighting and my dad would start hitting my mom, I'd stand up and shout and try to stand up for my mom and try to get my dad to stop it. But most of the time he would knock me off the chair and I'd get hurt, and then I was frightened. So I learned how, just to kind of curl up and retreat into my room, put the pillow over my head. That seemed to work better. Didn't really help my dad stop, but it felt better for me. Right? So we can even see how our clients may have had other instincts or other inclinations in terms of response patterns, but developed other ones just because they're little, and it was the only way that they could really protect themselves when the threat was really unbearable. So here we are now in our adult life, and we're walking around in the world, and suddenly it can be something as simple as someone, in your office just glares at you in a weird way. And that can feel like a threat if it's activating that feeling of, I'm in trouble. I did something wrong. I knew they'd figure it out eventually, that I don't really deserve to be here, that I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy of this job. And without even thinking all those thoughts, sometimes they come right to the surface, and They can be thought out loud, but most of the time they're happening really at an implicit level. And instead, the reactive process is happening quickly because there's that gasp or that imagined gasp. And we're moving into a mode, into a state of mind. I'm going to use different words here to try to capture this, because as we talk about modes in Module 2, it becomes a little bit complicated, but important and interesting and fascinating. We move to react, to respond. We move into a state of mind to protect ourselves. Of course, the truest form of protection would be to remain in a healthy adult mode where we can see with reason, with logic, with rational wisdom, with compassion for the part of us that's a little frightened or a lot frightened. And we can make sense out of it very quickly and say, okay, she's having a bad day. It's not my problem, Or, okay, I've had my head down on the desk all day. They probably think I'm busy. That's why they're not inviting me to lunch today. We can make sense out of it. Or maybe I need to make a little bit more effort to show that I'd like to be included. Maybe I've been a little standoffish, right? So we can evaluate ourselves when we're in our healthy adult mode. But if the threat leaves us in that helpless child place, even for a millisecond, we're going to then ignite the response system. And the response system will be one of these modes. If not our healthy adult, it's going to be one of these other coping responses. And what happens, as I said earlier, is that more often than not, if we enlist a coping response that we used when we were very young, it may bring some temporary relief, but it's more than likely going to perpetuate the very schemas that we are trying to avoid, the very ones. So if I'm in a fight mode, when I see someone look at me with a strange look in the workplace and they go off to make plans for lunch and don't include me, if I'm in fight mode, I might say to them, oh, nice, nice to think about me, all you think about is yourselves. I might actually go out after them with criticism. Who wants to be a part of your group anyway? And they're all looking at me like I'm kind of a bit of a crazy person, or what was I thinking? Or some might try to apologize, but they're doing it now because they're really concerned that I'm overreacting. Which in fact, I am, because I haven't actually investigated this carefully enough to ascertain whether or not they're just being rude, or they thought I was busy, or I've been coming across in a kind of aloof way. So all I've done is perpetuate the very thing I didn't want to do, was to make myself look badly and to become off-putting to the group. So we look with our clients very carefully at these response patterns, these response systems within them. Okay, and common forms of coping responses. These are just some examples to give you a sense. If you're in a surrender mode, it's pretty easy, right? If your coping response is one of submission, where you're giving in, or what we call the surrenderer, you're basically submitting. You're complying with whatever is being asked of you. You're going along, right? I'm just going along. I use the example sometimes of the big brown bear, right? The 13-foot giant brown bear that you've just been confronted with in the middle of the forest. And you could run, you could pick up the stick and try to fight for your life, or you might say, go ahead, devour me, get it over with. I can't take it, it's too frightening, right? So you submit, you just give in, because the giving in feels like the easiest way to avoid the unbearable pain that is associated with this threat. Avoidance can take many forms. We have clients who will come to us so often really from their coping responses. They're not reporting to us that they have this underlying feeling of defectiveness. They're saying to us, I have a drinking problem, or I shut down so fast, I'm so socially anxious. I avoid situations. Or they will overstimulate, right? They'll become stimulation junkies at times. So some will come to us and say, I can't seem to stop myself from using pornography, or my partner has found out I'm doing this and this is a problem. It's workaholism. So avoidance can take on many forms. It can be as simple as just sitting and becoming detached and watching television, burying oneself in busy work, or just becoming kind of spacey, shut down, shut out. The overcompensator, or the fight mode, right? The fight mode can show up in forms of aggression and hostility. It can be that kind of person who is excessively self-reliant, like, who needs you? I'm fine as I am. I'm fine as I'm on my own. That kind of hyper-autonomy as an overcompensation. Manipulation, they can manipulate. So they become, really chief manipulators at making the world work in the way they want it to work. Controlling, demanding, perfectionistic. These are examples of what we mean when we say fight, flight, and freeze or submit when we're talking about this in schema terms. And this is very important as we move into the next module together, where we'll be looking carefully at these modes, these maladaptive coping modes, because they are what will often show up first as the report in our treatment room. My partner says that I tend to be over-controlling, and she's feeling very left out of decision-making, and she's fed up with me, right? So sometimes they're reporting on what a loved one has said, or a coworker has said, or a boss has said about them. Or they'll come in and say, I'm the one who's always giving in. I'm so tired. There's never any space for me, and I feel selfish even just saying this, but I'm just so tired of always being the one. I'm becoming depressed. So we'll get reports of depression and anxiety, but often linked with these responses, as opposed to fully understanding these very strong, unbendable, inflexible, rigid, early maladaptive schemas that are driving the bus underneath and dictate what needs are not being met and what needs need to be met, which will be the basis for this work. And that is the end of Module 1.